I never thought a night like that would be the one to change my life. I walked into the restaurant with the kind of nervous hope that only someone who has been disappointed too many times can understand. The bell above the door chimed louder than it should have, like it was announcing the arrival of someone far more important than me. My dress was simple, a soft blue thing from a thrift store that I had ironed twice to make it look newer than it was. I had curled my hair with a cheap drugstore wand and prayed it would hold through the evening. I carried my entire dignity in my small purse and exactly $5 in cash. My stomach tightened as the hostess smiled. "Reservation for Anna," she said, and for a moment I felt like I belonged in a place like this. She led me to a small table by the window, the kind that glowed under warm lighting and made everyone look a little softer, a little more loved. I sat down carefully clutching the menu as if squeezing it hard enough would make the prices drop. My blind date was supposed to arrive at 7. I was 15 minutes early. I needed time to breathe, to settle the shaking in my hands, to convince myself that I was worth showing up for. 7 o'clock came. Then 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I kept lifting my eyes every time the door opened, my heart jumping like it was ready to run ahead of me. At 7:30, a message lit up my phone. For a second, relief washed through me. Then I opened it. "Wow, you actually went. I was just messing with you. You're not really my type, not worth the Uber." The words punched the air out of my lungs. I read them again because my brain refused to believe someone could be that cruel on purpose. The room around me blurred. The soft music, the quiet conversations, the clinking of glasses, all turned into distant noise. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. I forced myself not to cry. Not in public. Not in a place this beautiful. Not where people were already glancing at me like they knew exactly what had happened. A server approached me gently. "Miss, would you like to order something while you wait?" I swallowed hard. "He is not coming," I said, trying to smile even though my throat was tight. "I think I should just go." My stomach felt hollow both from hunger and humiliation. I grabbed my purse, stood up, and took a single step toward the door before a calm voice behind me stopped me in place. "Miss, your dinner has been taken care of." I turned slowly. At a table a few feet away sat a man in a charcoal coat sleeves rolled up posture, relaxed but alert. Beside him, a little girl with soft brown curls swung her legs under her chair, smiling at me like she had been waiting for me to look at her. The man nodded once politely, respectfully. No pity in his eyes, no judgment, no interest beyond simple decency. "You should eat," he said. "No one should leave hungry." I stood there frozen, unsure if this was kindness or another trick. The girl leaned forward. "Daddy says everyone deserves warm food," she said, as if it was the most obvious truth in the world. A few people nearby had started watching again, but this time the air felt different. Not mocking, not cruel, just quiet. I heard myself exhale. My legs carried me back to the table before my mind had fully decided to trust any of it. The server returned with a plate of pasta that smelled like heaven. I stared at it, at the steam rising in gentle curls at the fork placed neatly beside it. My voice came out small. "You did not have to do that." The man shook his head. "I know. You're here. You're hungry. That's enough." I sat down slowly. The first bite warmed me in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. As I ate, I could feel my heartbeat settling, the shame loosening its grip on my chest. Not disappearing, but easing. The girl kept smiling at me between tiny sips of lemonade. The man did not stare. He did not flirt. He did not ask questions. He simply existed in a calm, quiet way that felt strangely safe. When I finished eating, I stood again. "Thank you," I said softly. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," he replied. His daughter tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, can I give her my extra napkin flour?" He smiled and nodded. She handed me a small rose made from a folded napkin. I took it carefully, my eyes stinging for a reason that had nothing to do with humiliation anymore. Outside, rain had begun to fall hard. As I headed toward the door, the man rose and offered the umbrella he had brought. "Please take it. You'll get soaked." I hesitated, then accepted. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and wet, but my chest felt strangely warm. I only had $5 that night, but someone had treated me like I was worth far more than that. I did not know his name yet. I did not know why he had been so kind. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. That moment was going to change something. I could feel it. I just did not know how much. I walked out into the rain, holding the umbrella he had given me, feeling strangely aware of every raindrop that hit the ground around my shoes. The air was cool, sharp, almost cleansing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something break open inside me. Not pain this time, something gentler. I kept replaying the moment at the restaurant as I walked to the bus stop, clutching the small paper flower Sophie had made for me. Each time I looked at it, my chest tightened in an unfamiliar way. I had expected to walk out of that restaurant feeling humiliated, but instead I walked out feeling seen, and that terrified me. The bus never came. A sign taped to the post said the route was closed due to road work. My apartment was a 30-minute walk away in the rain, and the umbrella did little to stop the cold from slipping through my dress. I wrapped my arms around myself and kept walking. Halfway down the street, I heard footsteps behind me. Light, quick ones. Then a small voice. "Wait." I turned. Sophie was running toward me, her tiny boots splashing through puddles, her curls bouncing under the hood of her coat. Behind her, Luke walked quickly, umbrella in hand, expression tight with concern. Sophie reached me first, breathless. "Daddy forgot to say thank you." Luke caught up rain hitting his shoulders before he stepped under the umbrella again. "Sorry," he said, adjusting his coat. She insisted. Sophie nodded like this was a matter of global importance. "Daddy says thank you makes the world softer." Despite everything, I laughed softly. "Thank you for dinner," I said quietly. "And for the umbrella." Luke gave a small nod. It was nothing, but his eyes showed something else entirely. Something like understanding, something like recognition. The sidewalk was flooding with shallow water. Luke looked down at my shoes, thin and soaked. "You should not be walking this far in the rain." "It is fine." "It is not," he said gently. "You are freezing." His voice was calm, never forceful, never patronizing. Just steady. A kind of steady I had not felt from anyone in years. "My apartment is only a few blocks more," I said. He nodded once. "Then we will walk you." I opened my mouth to refuse, but Sophie had already taken my hand like she knew something I did not. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, warm despite the cold. "My dad says nice people should not walk alone at night," she announced confidently. "And you are a nice people." Her grammar made me smile before I could stop myself. Luke gave a quiet sigh, the kind that held a trace of a hidden laugh. We fell into step together, the three of us under one umbrella, though Luke stayed mostly in the rain to keep it covering Sophie and me. Every few seconds, he glanced at me as if checking to make sure I was not about to vanish. We walked past closed shops and glowing windows where families sat together eating dinner. The smell of warm bread drifted out from a bakery. A train rumbled in the distance. The whole world felt too calm for what the night had been. We reached my apartment building sooner than I expected. It was old, small paint chipping at the corners, but it was mine. I stopped under the awning and turned to face them. "Thank you," I said again. "You did not have to do any of this." Luke shook his head. "No one deserves to be left alone in the rain after a night like that." His voice was gentle but certain. Sophie tugged my sleeve. "Daddy says there are two kinds of heroes. The loud ones and the quiet ones. I think you are the quiet one." I stared at her, stunned. "Quiet things do not feel like heroics," I said softly. "They feel like surviving." Sophie shrugged like she already knew more about life than I did. "Surviving is a kind of brave." Something inside me almost cracked at that. Luke noticed his expression shifting with a kind of soft attentiveness that made my chest tighten. "We should let you rest," he said. "You have had a long night." I nodded and took a reluctant step toward the door. Then I turned. "I do not know your names." The girl lifted her hand excitedly. "I am Sophie, and this is Daddy." Daddy sighed. "Luke," he corrected gently. "Luke Brennan." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The name sounded familiar, like something I had heard before but never paid attention to. I decided not to think too hard about it. "I am Anna." Sophie beamed. "I like that." Luke held out his hand slightly, not for a handshake, more a gesture of acknowledgement. "Take care of yourself, Anna." I nodded and watched them turn away, the rain catching in the light as they disappeared down the street. I went inside, but could not bring myself to turn on the lights. I stood in the dark, still holding the umbrella, still clutching the tiny paper flower in my other hand. Something in my life had shifted. I could feel it, like an invisible door had opened somewhere I had not expected. He was a stranger, but he had not acted like one, and somehow that made him impossible to forget. 3 days passed before I saw him again, though I would never admit how often I found myself glancing toward the restaurant window or checking the bus stop where we had walked in the rain. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a strange night, a moment of unexpected kindness that meant more to me than it should have. I returned to my routine classes at the nursing program, long hours at the library, part-time shifts at the diner, pretending that everything felt normal. But it did not. Something lingering from that night stayed with me like warmth that refused to fade. On the third morning, I walked into the small campus coffee shop more for the heat than the caffeine. My shoes were still damp from the early rain, and the place smelled like cinnamon-burnt espresso and too much ambition. I stood at the counter digging through my coin purse, counting out change for the cheapest drink on the menu. A voice behind me said quietly, "Add oat milk to hers, too." I froze. I turned slowly. Luke was leaning against the wall near the pickup station, hands in his coat pockets, a calm, quiet smile on his face. Sophie peeked out from behind his legs and waved at me with both hands. "You remembered us," she said proudly, as if I had been the one who disappeared for 3 days instead of him. I laughed breathlessly. "I could say the same to you." Luke stepped forward a bit, his expression polite but warm. "I am sorry we vanished that night. Things got hectic." Sophie sniffed dramatically. "Daddy spilled juice on the important papers." Luke gave her a look that was half sternness, half amusement. "I told you not to announce that to strangers." "I am not a stranger," she insisted. "She is Anna." That settled the matter in her mind completely. Luke sighed softly, but there was affection in it. "Your drink is coming up," he said, nodding toward the barista who was steaming milk. "And I already paid. You really do not have to keep doing that," I said quietly. "I know," he replied simply. That was what made it both confusing and comforting. We found a table near the window, Sophie climbing into the chair across from me without hesitation. Luke sat beside her, loosening his scarf. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular. Sophie told me about her school art project. Luke talked about how she refused to eat anything green unless it was shaped like a dinosaur. I found myself smiling more than I expected. Then there was a moment, one of those small, fragile moments where a shift happens before anyone notices it. Sophie held up a drawing she had done on the back of a napkin. 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "This is me," she said, pointing proudly. "This is Daddy, and this is Mommy in heaven." My heart stopped. I looked at Luke. Something flickered across his face, a tightening around the eyes, a small pause in his breath. He reached over slowly, smoothing a wrinkle in the napkin. "That is beautiful," he murmured to her. Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Mommy sits on a star now. Daddy says stars take care of people." Luke swallowed hard, then forced a small smile. "That is right." I watched him closely. He did not crumble. He did not break. He did not run. But for a second, his guard slipped just enough for me to see something raw beneath it. Grief. Deep. Old. Still alive. I did not say anything. I did not ask. I knew too well what the polite world expects you to hide. After a moment, Luke straightened slightly. He tried to shift the energy back to something lighter. "Sophie, why don't you go choose a book from the corner?" She hopped off the chair and ran to the little reading nook, curls bouncing. When she was out of earshot, Luke stared at his hands. His voice, when he spoke, was lower, thinner. "Her mom used to sit exactly where you are sitting." I felt my breath catch. He blinked once, twice, like he regretted the words as soon as they escaped. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "I did not mean to put that on you." I shook my head slowly. "You did not. It is just part of your story, and I think she must have been someone very special." His jaw tightened slightly. She was. A soft understatement loaded with everything he could not say. He took a slow breath, almost as if he was bracing against something. I should not talk about it. It has been a long time. I nodded. You do not have to explain anything to me. His shoulders eased just a bit. For a moment, we just sat there while rain streaked the window and the coffee machine hissed in the background. Outside, the world rushed on, but at our table, everything felt suspended warm, careful. Then Sophie returned with a picture book about sea animals and shoved it proudly toward me. Read, she asked hopefully. Luke started to stop her. Sophie Anna is busy. I shook my head. I would love to. She crawled into the chair next to me, leaning her head against my arm like she had known me much longer than she had. Luke watched her, then me, with a look I could not decipher. Something between gratitude and uncertainty. Something that made my stomach twist in a different kind of way. We read the book from cover to cover, Sophie giggling every time I made a sea creature noise. When she begged me to read it again, Luke finally stepped in. We should let Anna go to class, Sophie pouted. She likes us, she whispered loudly, which made me laugh again. Luke rubbed his forehead, but he was smiling. I walked them outside when we finished. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet and shiny. Sophie hugged my legs before running ahead to splash in puddles. Luke stood beside me quietly for a moment. Thank you, he said. For what? I asked softly. For being kind to her. For letting her be herself with you. For a second, his voice cracked on the last word. I looked up at him. He seemed taller in the gray light, steadier but also carrying a weight I had not fully understood until that moment. I am glad she feels comfortable with me. He nodded once. She does not open up easily. Neither do I, if I am honest. I smiled gently. Most people do not. He looked at me, then really looked like he was seeing something he had not expected. His next words came out before he could catch them. You remind me of hope. I blinked, stunned. Before I could respond, he cleared his throat abruptly and looked away. I will see you around Anna. And then he walked off quickly as though he could outrun the sentence he had just let slip. I watched him disappear down the street, carrying a small child and a heavy past and something he had accidentally revealed to me. He did not know it yet, but that sentence would stay with me for a long, long time. 2 days later, I found myself walking through the small neighborhood pharmacy with Sophie's tiny hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers. Luke had an early meeting and asked if I could help pick up the children's cough syrup she needed. It was nothing complicated, nothing dramatic, just one small errand that somehow made me feel strangely honored. The kind of trust you do not expect from a man who carries so much silence. Sophie hummed as she walked beside me, her curls bouncing the sleeves of her little sweater slightly too long. Every few steps, she would swing our joined hands like it was a game, and I let her because something about her joy felt contagious. We reached the counter, and I scanned the shelf for the brand Luke mentioned. When I finally found it, I reached up and the hem of my thrift store jacket rode up a little, revealing the worn stitching at the wrist. The woman behind the counter eyed me like she was assessing the value of everything I was wearing at once. Need help with something? She asked, her voice carrying the kind of tone that implied she already disapproved of the answer. Just this, I smiled politely, placing the bottle gently on the counter. The woman raised a brow. This one is expensive. I nodded awkwardly. Yes, I know. She tapped her long nails on the register. Insurance. No, I am just paying cash. Her eyes drifted from my face down to my shoes, the scuffed ones I had been wearing for 4 years, then back up again. Her lip curled almost imperceptibly. You work around here? She asked it like an accusation. I hesitated. I study here. Nursing school. And I work at the library. Her brows lifted higher, amusement flickering across her face. Nursing school. Really? I exhaled slowly. Yes. Before I could say more, a voice from behind spoke loud enough for half the store to hear. She does not look like a nursing student. I turned to see a woman holding a designer purse, her expression smug. Some girls think if they look pathetic enough, someone will pay for them. My stomach clenched. Sophie looked up at me instantly, sensing something was wrong. I tightened my hand around hers. The woman stepped closer, almost like she was curious to see how I would react. First, a man buys her dinner, now she is in here buying medicine she probably cannot afford. It must be nice to play helpless. Something hot and sharp rose in my chest. Embarrassment, anger, shame. A familiar cocktail I had tasted more times than I wanted to admit. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Words scattered, my throat closed, and the air thickened. Then I heard footsteps behind me, quick, determined, steady. Luke's voice cut through the tension, not loud, but edged with steel. "That is enough." The room stilled. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of me in a way that felt natural, protective, without being possessive. He looked at the cashier first. She is not asking for anything but basic respect. Then he looked at the woman with the designer purse. "And you should be embarrassed speaking to anyone like that, especially in front of a child." The woman's face flushed an angry red. "Excuse me, who are you?" He blinked once, slowly unbothered. "Someone who knows kindness when he sees it. Someone who teaches his daughter not to treat people like trash." The woman sputtered, but no words came. She grabbed her purse and stormed away, muttering under her breath. The cashier cleared her throat awkwardly and reached for the bottle, muttering the price without meeting my eyes. Luke placed his card on the counter before I could reach into my pocket. I protested immediately. "Luke, I can pay for it. I want to." He shook his head once. "This is for Sophie. Let me take care of my daughter." I swallowed hard and nodded. We stepped outside into the cold air, and the door closed behind us with a soft click. For a moment, none of us said anything. Sophie stood quietly between us, her small hand still gripping mine. I felt my embarrassment lingering like smoke. "I should not have brought her here," I murmured. "I did not think people would—" Luke turned to me sharply. "Do not do that. Do not carry the cruelty they handed you." I met his eyes, and something inside me cracked a little. He knelt in front of Sophie, adjusting her scarf gently. "Do you know what we do when someone is mean?" Sophie's eyes widened. "We do not listen to them." "Exactly. We focus on the people who actually know us." Sophie looked up at me and nodded solemnly. "Anna is nice. Very nice." My throat tightened. Luke stood again, turning to me. "You handled it better than most adults would." I shook my head. I froze. I always freeze in moments like that. He studied me quietly. "Freezing is not weakness. It is surviving." We walked toward the parking lot slowly, Sophie hopping between puddles while holding both our hands. The sky was overcast with the kind of gray that makes the world feel small and tender. I finally exhaled. "Thank you, Luke." "Really, you did not have to step in like that." He looked straight ahead. "Maybe not. But I wanted to." The simplicity of it hit harder than any grand gesture. No pity, no performance, just truth. When we reached his car, he opened the door for Sophie, then turned back to me. "I know today hurt, but do not let people like that define you. They do not see what I see." I swallowed. "And what do you see?" His eyes softened in a way that made me catch my breath. Someone strong, stronger than she realizes. Heat rose in my chest, something quiet and unfamiliar. I stepped back a little, needing space to breathe. "I should get to class." He nodded, though his eyes lingered a second longer than necessary. "Thank you for helping with Sophie. I will see you soon, Anna." And then he drove away, leaving me standing in the parking lot, holding a bottle of children's medicine and the weight of everything that had just happened. Humiliation, protection, confusion. But beneath it all, a warmth that scared me more than the cruelty ever could. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had stood between me and the world. And part of me wished he would not stop. I did not mean to see anything. That is the truth I keep repeating to myself even now. It happened so quickly, so unintentionally, that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But that night, something cracked open, and I finally understood that the man I thought I knew, the man who carried quiet grief and gentle strength, was someone I had never really seen at all. It started with Sophie. She wanted to show me her newest drawing, a masterpiece according to her, a picture made entirely with pink markers. We were all sitting in Luke's living room, the kind of space that felt lived in but still orderly. Toys tucked into baskets, picture books scattered across the coffee table, and a faint citrus scent that always reminded me of clean laundry and sunlight. Sophie climbed into my lap, chattering excitedly about her day while Luke reheated soup in the kitchen. She handed me her drawing with the seriousness of someone presenting a diploma. I gasped dramatically, and she beamed, burying her face against my shoulder. "Anna likes it," she announced proudly to no one in particular. "I do," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. She reached over for more paper, and when she tugged too hard, the stack slipped off the table, scattering across the floor near the couch. Papers fluttered everywhere. Crayons rolled under the furniture. I bent down to gather them before stepping on one. That was all I intended to do. I reached for the pages, and a white envelope slid halfway out from underneath the couch, as if nudged forward by the movement. The corner of it had the embossed logo of Brennan Holdings. I blinked. The logo was distinct a silver crest I had seen once or twice in financial news articles displayed on screens in the university lounge. But never at this size, never staring at me from an envelope hidden under Luke's couch. My hand hesitated. I should have ignored it. I should have pushed it back exactly where it had been. But curiosity tugged softly at my sleeve, and before I could stop myself, I reached for it. The envelope was already open, the contents slightly folded. I did not pull anything out. I just adjusted it enough that one visible line caught my eyes. Quarterly board schedule. Board, as in corporate board. My pulse quickened. I set the envelope back exactly where it had fallen and gathered the rest of Sophie's drawings, trying to steady my breath. But something had shifted in the room. Something inside me refused to return to the quiet ignorance I had lived in before. When I sat back down, Sophie immediately curled against me again, humming as she colored. I forced myself to smile and hold her gently, but my mind was no longer calm. Luke returned carrying 2 bowls of soup and handed me one with his usual warmth. "You didn't have to help pick up everything he said lightly." I shrugged. "It's nothing. She is 5. Chaos follows her naturally." He laughed under his breath and sat across from me. He looked tired that night, his shirt sleeves rolled up a faint shadow across his jaw, and that sadness that always lived behind his eyes. The same sadness that first made me trust him. But now I wondered how much of that sadness came from a life he never talked about. When Sophie fell asleep curled on the couch, I adjusted the blanket over her and tried to steady my breathing. My mind kept circling around the envelope. Brennan Holdings. The name felt like an answer to a question I did not know I had asked, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it belonged to a relative. Maybe he simply kept documents for someone else. Anything was possible. I stood to leave around 9. Luke walked me to the door the way he always did. But when I turned to say goodbye, my eyes drifted over his shoulder to the hallway. A laptop sat open on the console table, its screen still lit. Rows of numbers filled the page, a spreadsheet I did not understand. But the header at the top was unmistakable. Dividend forecast, Brennan Nutrition, parent company, Brennan Holdings. My chest tightened. I did not say anything. I am not sure I even breathed. Luke followed my gaze, realized what I saw, and for a fraction of a second everything inside him stilled. His expression shifted not into fear, not into anger, but into resignation. The kind a person wears when the truth has been trying to surface for a long time and finally reaches open air. "Anna," he said softly, but the softness hurt. Because suddenly, the distance between us felt enormous. I shook my head slightly. "You do not have to explain anything," but the words sounded thin and fragile. He stepped closer, voice low. "I should have told you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and the truth hit like a slow wave, pulling me under. The tailored suit, the quiet confidence, the way people deferred to him effortlessly, the depth behind his silence. He was not just a single dad who happened to be kind. He was someone with power, influence, money, all the things I had never had in my life. "Why didn't you say anything?" I whispered before I could stop myself. He exhaled long and heavy. "Because people treat me differently when they know. And I liked the way you talked to me before you knew anything." I swallowed hard. So I was just someone different, someone safe. His eyes softened, and something in them broke open. "You were the one person who didn't want anything from me. That mattered more than you know." My throat tightened, and for a moment neither of us moved. Sophie stirred on the couch, and Luke glanced back at her before turning to me again. "I'm still me," he murmured. "Nothing you saw changes that." Except it did. Not because he had lied. He hadn't. He had just not told me. But because suddenly I felt small again, like the girl with $5 in her purse sitting alone at a table meant for people with better lives. I nodded stiffly, unable to trust my voice. I should go. He reached for my arm, but stopped himself before touching my sleeve. "Anna, wait." I stepped back. Not in anger, in self-defense. "I need time." He swallowed and nodded. "I understand." And I knew he did. That was the worst part. I walked out into the night with a shaking breath and the memory of his eyes following me as I left. The truth was simple. I had never been meant to see who he really was, and now that I had everything between us would change. I spent the next 2 days pretending everything inside me had not changed while knowing perfectly well that it had. I went to class. I worked my shift at the diner. I studied late into the night as if knowledge could drown confusion. But every time I paused, every time my mind had even a second of quiet, the same thought returned like an echo that would not soften. Luke Brennan was not the man I thought he was. Except he also was. That contradiction sat heavy in my chest. I waited for anger to show up, but it never did. What came instead was sadness. A slow, aching sadness that made it hard to breathe because I kept replaying his face the night I realized the truth. He had not defended himself. He had not denied anything. He had simply accepted the moment as if he had lost something. And maybe he had. By the third morning, I could not take the gnawing weight any longer. I needed to see him, needed to look him in the eye and ask the questions that had taken root in my ribs. So I texted him. "Can I stop by after class?" I typed, then paused, deleted, tried again. "Can we talk?" Shorter, safer. I hit send before fear could stop me. His reply came quickly. "Anytime." The simplicity of it both steadied and rattled me. That evening I walked to his house with the kind of nerves I had not felt since childhood when I used to approach closed doors without knowing what waited behind them. The porch light was on. The living room glowed softly through the windows. I knocked gently. He opened the door almost immediately as if he had been standing there waiting. His eyes were tired but warm. "Anna, come in." I stepped inside and the familiar scent of lemon and home wrapped around me. Sophie was asleep on the couch, her tiny hands curled under her cheek. The sight softened something inside me. Luke motioned toward the kitchen where 2 mugs sat waiting. He had already made tea. The gesture made my throat tighten. We sat across from each other at the table, the silence thick, but not hostile, just full of things we did not yet know how to say. Finally, I spoke. "I am not upset, you know." He looked up slowly. "Then what are you?" I let out a long, shaky breath. "Confused." "I thought you were just Luke." He nodded once. "I am. But you are also someone else. Someone people write articles about. Someone with a driver and a board seat and a world I do not belong to." He leaned back slightly, his hands folded loosely on the table. "You think that world is me. It is part of you. And I do not know how to be around that." His gaze softened. "Anna, I did not hide because I am ashamed of it. I hid because people stop talking to me like a person when they know." I blinked, and I did not. "You looked at me the way my wife used to before things got complicated," he said quietly. With kindness that feels like sunlight. His honesty caught me off guard. I swallowed hard. I am still the same person. You are still the same man. But now, everything feels different. He exhaled slowly. "I know. That is why I gave you space, and why I will give you more if you need it." But sitting across from him looking at the slump of his shoulders and the regret in his eyes, something softened in me. He had not disappeared into arrogance or anger. He looked smaller than ever, more human, more breakable. I found myself whispering, "I do not want space. I just want to understand." He nodded once as if bracing for something painful. "Ask." So I did. "Why are you alone so much?" His eyes flickered. "Because losing someone you love makes you afraid to love again." It was the kind of answer that hollowed the air between us. I reached for my tea just to keep my hands from trembling. Another question rose before I could stop it. Why did you help me that night? His voice lowered to almost a whisper. Because you reminded me of someone who kept trying long after people gave her reasons not to. I froze. Your wife. He nodded slowly. She believed in kindness the way most people believe in oxygen, and her last year when she was too sick to walk, she told me not to let the world turn me hard. And then I saw you sitting alone, holding your spine straight like it was the only thing keeping you from falling apart, and something in me remembered. His voice broke slightly and he cleared his throat. I thought she would have fed you just like I did. My breath caught. Grief moved between us, not heavy but tender, like something shared without being spoken. I leaned slightly forward. Luke, you do not have to carry everything alone. He shook his head. I do not want to put weight on you. I almost laughed despite the heaviness. That is not how kindness works. He smiled faintly, the first small smile in days. I looked down at my hands, then forced myself to say what I had come to say. If you ever need help with Sophie, I can babysit, or bring food, or anything. I just want to be useful. Luke's expression shifted instantly, not to gratitude, but to discomfort. Anna, no. You do not owe me anything. I was not offering out of debt. I know, but I cannot accept help like that. It feels like I am asking you to take on my life. I blinked slowly. I am offering not because I pity you, but because I care. He lowered his gaze. That is what scares me. His honesty cut through me. For a long moment, we just sat there breathing in the same quiet truth. Finally, he murmured, You deserve someone uncomplicated, someone who does not come with a child and a company and a broken heart. I shook my head firmly. Luke, I am not asking for anything. I am just here. He looked up slowly and something warm flickered in his eyes. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But something close. Thank you, he whispered, for not running. I looked at him and said softly, I tried. He let out a breath that sounded too much like a laugh and too much like relief. And then Sophie stirred on the couch and he stood to check on her, leaving the sentence unfinished but understood. I watched him gently tuck the blanket around her shoulders, and I realized something I had not admitted to myself until that moment. I didn't help him because he needed saving. I helped him because for the first time in my life, helping someone felt like home, and that terrified me more than anything. For a few days after that night, something gentle settled between us, something warm but fragile, like a candle flame that flickered whenever either of us breathed too deeply. Luke would text me short messages, mostly updates about Sophie's cough or a picture she drew that looked vaguely like a cat but had wings. I would reply with little things like recipes for herbal tea or reminders to let her nap upright. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, just small threads of connection like stitching we both pretended not to notice. Then, on the fourth day, everything changed. It started with silence. Not long silence at first, just the kind that makes you glance at your phone twice, then 3 times wondering if you missed something. I told myself he was busy. A CEO probably had far more important things to think about than a girl he bought dinner for once, a girl who was trying too hard not to care. By the second day, the silence felt colder. I stopped by the cafe where we usually crossed paths in the morning. Luke was not there. The barista who always recognized him shook her head when I asked. He has not been in all week, she said. Strange for him. He usually camps in that corner table. My stomach twisted. I tried to push the worry down, telling myself it was none of my business, but the truth was that worry had already built its own home inside me. The third day hit harder. I stopped by the little bookstore near the library because sometimes he brought Sophie there after daycare. The owner, a warm woman with silver streaks in her hair, frowned when I asked casually about him. He came by to return books but said they were moving offices downtown, looked rushed, distracted, and he had the little one with him. My heart sank. Moving offices. No warning, no goodbye, no explanation. It felt like standing on a frozen lake that suddenly cracked beneath me. I walked home slowly numb in a way that had nothing to do with the November cold. At my doorstep, I hesitated before unlocking the door, sensing something different in the air. And then I saw it. A small cream envelope placed neatly under my door. My name written in careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in half. Anna, thank you for everything, for being kind when you did not have to be, for making Sophie smile when she had forgotten how, for reminding me what gentleness feels like. I will not forget it. L. That was it. No explanation. No promise to stay in touch. No hint of where he had gone. And beneath the note, something else slipped out into my palm. A black card. Heavy. Matte. Unmarked except for a small engraved chip and a string of discrete numbers. I stared at it, stunned. It felt like an object that did not belong in my hands. I had seen cards like this online. Exclusive. Elite. Worth more than everything I owned combined. It was the kind of thing billionaires used to pay for entire floors of hotels, not the kind of thing given as a thank you to a girl who lived in a tiny apartment and juggled 2 jobs. And then anger arrived. Slow at first, like a spark, then sharp, hot, furious. It wasn't the extravagant card, it wasn't the money, it was the disappearance. The way he had slipped quietly out of my life as if he had never been in it, as if I had imagined the warmth, the trust, the fragile something that had been growing in the quiet spaces between our conversations. I sat on the floor, leaning against the door, the card clutched in my fist, and I felt something inside me crack. I whispered into the empty room, "You could have said goodbye. You owed me that." But the truth came back fast and cruel. He owed me nothing. I wasn't his girlfriend. I wasn't his family. I wasn't even officially his friend. I was just a moment he had now closed like a door. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the look on his face the night he said kindness scares him because it asks for trust. Maybe disappearing was safer for him. Maybe it was easier than letting someone in again. But knowing that didn't make the pain softer. The next morning, I tried to go about my day pretending the world hadn't shifted. I cleaned my apartment. I studied for an exam. I worked a long shift at the diner, smiling through conversations I didn't hear. But everything felt muted, like someone had turned the volume of my life down, and grief that had no name sat quietly in my chest. On the 5th day, I went to the library early, hoping routine would help. As I shelved books, I reached into my coat pocket and felt the hard, cold weight of the card still there. I pulled it out and stared at it. It reflected nothing back at me. No clue, no message, no explanation. Just an object that symbolized distance more than anything else. "Why leave me this?" I whispered. But the room stayed silent. When my shift ended, I walked home slowly, stepping through piles of fallen leaves. The wind tugged at my hair, and for a moment, I let myself imagine what I would say if Luke were standing at the end of the street. Would I be angry? Would I ask him why? Or would I simply break down and admit that losing someone who was never mine should not hurt this much? When I reached my apartment, I paused again at the door, expecting another envelope, another sign, some small acknowledgement that I mattered even a little. But there was nothing, just the quiet hallway, just the hinge creaking as I stepped inside, just the heavy ache settling deeper. I placed the card and the note in the drawer of my nightstand, unable to throw them away, unable to look at them without my chest tightening. And then, for the first time in a very long time, I cried. Not the delicate kind, the gut-deep kind that comes from a place below words. Because in losing Luke, I realized something I had not dared admit. I had let myself hope. And hope, when taken away, leaves a kind of emptiness that echoes. For the rest of the week, I moved through my life like a ghost. Luke had vanished from every place he had once been, and it felt like he had taken the light with him. And I told myself 100 times that it would fade, that I would forget that it was nothing more than a passing story. But every night when I opened my drawer and saw that black card lying there untouched and impossible, I knew the truth. Some absences feel louder than any presence, and his was one of them. The week after Luke disappeared felt like someone had quietly reached into my life and pulled out the one thread that had been holding everything together. and I did not notice how important that thread had become until everything around me began to unravel faster than I could catch it. It started on Monday morning when I arrived at the library for my shift, only to find a taped notice on the glass door written in the kind of cold official language that never fails to sting. Due to budget reductions, all part-time staffing hours have been suspended effective immediately. Please return your key and badge to administration. I read it twice then, a third time, hoping the words would shift into something reasonable, but they stayed the same blunt and merciless. The head librarian, a woman with soft eyes and silver earrings, placed a gentle hand on my arm. "I am so sorry, Anna. We fought for the positions, but the board would not move." I nodded, trying to smile, even though I felt something inside my chest sink slowly like a stone, dropping through water. She hugged me before I left, and for the first time in months, someone asked me, "Are you okay?" And I wanted to scream, "No," but I whispered, "Yes," then walked out into the cold morning with no job and no idea what to do next. By Wednesday, my hours at the diner were cut too. The owner, a tired man who had run the place for 30 years, pulled me aside and rubbed the back of his neck. "We just don't have the customers to keep everyone on." "I am sorry, kiddo." He gave me a free bowl of soup after my shift, like that could fix the reality that my income had been sliced in half. When I got home that night, I opened my fridge and stared at the half carton of eggs, the last 2 slices of bread, and a few apples that had begun to wrinkle. Even the refrigerator hummed louder, as if reminding me how empty it was. On Thursday, my landlord slid a notice under my door, reminding me rent was due in 10 days with late fees starting immediately after. I sat on the floor, holding that piece of paper, and felt the air leave my lungs. My hands trembled, but not from fear exactly. It was that numb kind of panic that happens when too many things fall apart at once, and you cannot decide which fire to try to put out first. That night, when I checked my bank account, I had $32.19. I stared at the number until it blurred. $32 was not enough to fix anything. It was not enough to breathe. On Friday, the universe seemed determined to finish what it had started. My study advisor emailed to inform me that unless I paid the remaining balance on my tuition hold, I would not be eligible for next semester's clinical placement. I read the message sitting on the bus on my way home, surrounded by people who seemed to have somewhere to be, someone waiting, someone who would notice if they did not come home. I had never felt more invisible. That evening, I walked to the grocery store hoping the fresh air would clear my head, but all it did was sharpen the ache in my chest. Inside the store, I picked up a bag of rice, then put it back, picked up pasta, then put it back. I walked in circles around the aisles trying to calculate how many meals $32 could buy and still failing. Eventually, I grabbed a loaf of discounted bread and a jar of peanut butter, then stood in line behind a woman buying organic fruit and gourmet cheeses with a cart so full she had to unload it in sections. I stared at the back of her coat, wishing for just one moment that I knew what it felt like to buy food without counting every penny. When I reached the register, the cashier said the total, and I handed her exact change because pennies suddenly mattered. On the walk home, the wind cut through my coat, and I felt small in a way I had not felt since childhood when my mother used to wrap me in blankets we could barely afford and whisper that someday things would be better. Someday. I wondered when someday would come. That night, my apartment felt colder than usual, even with the heater on. I sat on the floor leaning against my bed, eating peanut butter on toast, and trying to convince myself that this was temporary, that I had survived worse, that I could survive this too. But my thoughts kept circling back to Luke and the quiet space he had left behind. I wanted to hate him for disappearing, but the truth was he had been one of the few bright spots in a life that had been flickering for too long. I whispered into the empty room, "I wish you had stayed." Then I immediately felt foolish because why would a CEO who lived in glass offices and traveled with a nanny and had every resource at his fingertips stay connected to a girl who had $5 for dinner? On Saturday, the low point arrived. I woke up to a freezing apartment because the heat had shut off. When I called the office, the manager told me my unit was overdue for maintenance fees, which I had completely forgotten about, and the system automatically paused utilities until it was paid. I sat on the edge of my bed, wrapped in 3 sweaters and one thin blanket, fighting the urge to cry again. I checked the nightstand drawer out of habit, the place where the black card still rested untouched, like a secret I had no right to hold. I opened the drawer slowly, staring at the smooth, dark surface. It would solve everything: rent, groceries, tuition, heat. One swipe and my entire world could unbreak itself. I reached for it with shaking fingers, then pulled my hand back violently as if the card were hot. "No," I whispered. "Not like that." I closed the drawer and pressed my forehead against it, trying to breathe through the heaviness in my chest. By Sunday morning, I felt hollow, like the week had carved something out of me. I sat at my tiny kitchen table, staring at the steam from my cheap instant coffee curling upward in thin wisps. I tried to imagine a way out, a way forward, something hopeful, but all I could see were stacked bills, unanswered emails, and the empty space beside me where a man with tired eyes and a gentle voice had once sat. The quiet of the room felt suffocating. The weight of the entire week pressed down on me until I whispered out loud the truest thing I had admitted in days: I am not okay. And the worst part was, there was no one to hear it. By Monday morning, I had accepted that the week had broken me in places I did not know could bend, and I woke up with the kind of exhausted numbness that makes even getting out of bed feel like lifting a world that is not built for you. I wrapped my hands around a cup of instant coffee, letting the heat warm my fingers, even if it could not reach anything deeper. Just as I took a sip, something slid under my door, a soft, scratching sound that made me look up. No one knocked. No footsteps followed, just silence. Then the thin edge of an envelope peeking from beneath the frame. For a long moment, I simply stared at it because life had not exactly been sending me pleasant surprises lately, and part of me feared it was another bill, another notice, another reminder that I was running out of places to fall. Eventually, I stood crossed the room and picked it up. The envelope was thick cream-colored with my name handwritten across the front in a steady, confident script, someone who wrote slowly, "Not rushed." My stomach tightened. No return address, no company logo. Just my name written like it mattered. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were two things: a formal letter on heavy paper and a small embossed card bearing the simple gold initials BF. For a moment, I could not breathe because those initials were the same ones I had seen on the email header the night I Googled Luke Brennan. Brennan Foundation. My pulse hammered as I unfolded the letter. "Dear Miss Brooks, you are invited to interview for the position of Community Liaison with the Brennan Foundation. Candidates are selected by personal recommendation only. Travel arrangements have been made on your behalf. Please arrive at our downtown office at the time indicated below. Sincerely, Office of the Executive Director, Brennan Foundation." Underneath, typed in smaller ink, one more line. "Recommended by Luke Brennan." I sank into the nearest chair, gripping the letter with both hands, reading it again and again. My throat tightened. Luke. After everything, after disappearing, after leaving no explanation, no closure, he had done this. He had found me. He had reached out, and he had done it quietly, the same way he once paid for my dinner and walked away like kindness did not need applause. I pressed the letter to my chest and let a shaky breath leave me. Hope did not just return, it crashed into me so fast I almost could not process it. One minute I was drowning, the next, someone had thrown me a lifeline from a world I never expected to be part of. I looked around my tiny apartment with its peeling paint and cold air and cluttered textbooks and realized I could not let fear keep me anchored here. Not today. I packed my one professional outfit, a simple navy dress with a cardigan, and rode the bus downtown, clutching the letter like it was a precious artifact. The city grew brighter, the buildings taller, the sidewalks busier, and the closer I got to the address, the more unreal everything felt. When the bus stopped in front of the building, I froze. Glass and steel stretched upward like something out of a world where people had assistants and planners and salaries that did not vanish overnight. People in tailored suits rushed past me, scanning badges at the revolving doors. I looked down at my thrift store heels and swallowed hard. "You belong here," I whispered, even though I did not believe it yet. Inside the lobby, marble floors glowed beneath soft lighting, and a receptionist greeted me with the kind of polished kindness I had never been on the receiving end of. "Appointment for Anna Brooks," she asked with a professional smile. Before I answered, she glanced at her screen, then looked back at me, her expression warming. You're expected on the 32nd floor. Please take the elevator on the left. 32 floors. I stepped inside the elevator, feeling the doors close like something significant was sealing itself behind me, and the numbers climbed faster than my heartbeat. I fixed my cardigan, took a slow breath, tried to convince myself not to panic. When the elevator chimed and the doors opened, I stepped into a quiet hallway with floor-to-ceiling windows spilling golden light. The air smelled like citrus and clean paper. A woman in a sleek navy dress approached. "Miss Brooks, please follow me." She led me through a glass corridor into a large open office with warm wood floors and large plants near the windows. My palms were sweating. My chest was tight. Then she opened a door to a private conference room and said, "He will be right in." He, not the director, not a manager. Him. I stood alone for a few seconds, staring at the soft leather chairs, the framed photos of smiling children, the polished table. Then I heard the door behind me open. I turned. Luke stood there, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, crisp shirt, no tie, but looking every bit the man the internet claimed him to be. Powerful, composed a leader. But his eyes, those were the same eyes that had watched me across a restaurant table, with quiet empathy, the same eyes that once softened when his daughter laughed. When he saw me, he exhaled a breath that looked like something he had been holding for far too long. "You came," he said softly, almost like he was afraid speaking louder would break the moment. I swallowed my nerves. "You invited me." He took a few slow steps toward me, his hands relaxed but his expression unreadable except for the slightest flicker of relief. "I hoped you would say yes," he said. The room felt smaller with him standing that close, not threatening but steady, reassuring, exactly the way he felt the first night we met, before I knew anything about him, before the world reminded me how far apart we were. Luke gestured to the chairs. "Sit with me." His voice low, gentle, almost hesitant. I sat. He did too, leaving a careful, measured space between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was heavy, full of everything we had not said. Finally, he looked at me. "Anna, I know you must have questions." I opened the letter again, letting the paper rest in my hands. "Why did you recommend me?" Luke held my gaze. "Because you deserved someone to open a door for you after you spent your whole life knocking on the wrong ones." Something cracked inside me, a soundless shift like a frozen river beginning to thaw. He continued, his voice firmer, but threaded with something almost vulnerable. "And because I owed you more than a black card and a note." His words were simple, but they hit deeper than he seemed to realize. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just enough to breathe without pain. He leaned back, his expression softening. "I did not disappear because I did not care," he said quietly. "I disappeared because I cared too much." My breath caught, but he lifted a hand slightly. "Not yet. Not here. One truth at a time." I nodded slowly, letting the words settle like warm light sinking into cold places. For the first time since that awful week, I felt something impossible and beautiful flicker back to life. Hope. Luke watched me with the same steady patience he had shown that night in the restaurant. Then, with a quiet inhale, he said, "Anna, would you let me explain everything?" And I realized I wanted nothing more. For a long moment after he asked if I would let him explain everything, I simply stared at him, unsure if my voice would work, because there were too many questions, too many emotions, too many things inside me aching to be understood. And yet, something steadier than fear whispered that I needed to hear whatever truth he had carried alone for so long. Luke leaned forward, resting his hands loosely together, his posture open but careful, like a man approaching a wound he did not want to cause again. "Anna," he began quietly, "I wish I could tell you that I left because I got busy or because life got complicated, but that would be a lie, and I think you deserve better than that." My throat tightened. "Then why did you disappear?" He exhaled softly, eyes drifting toward the window where the city glowed in muted gold before returning directly to mine. "Because I started to care about you faster than I should have, and that terrified me." The room fell still. My heart stumbled. He continued, his voice low but unwavering. "You walked into that restaurant with $5 and more dignity than anyone in that room gave you credit for. You held yourself together when someone tried to humiliate you, and you did not take charity even when you were starving." His jaw tightened, the memory flickering painful in his eyes. That kind of strength I had not seen in a long time, not since before my wife got sick. My breath caught. He paused for a long moment, like he needed to gather the pieces of a truth he had held too tightly. When she died, I decided the safest way to live was to never let anyone close enough to lose again. Sophie was my whole world, and loving her was safe because love for a child demands everything but expects nothing. But loving a woman again that felt dangerous. He swallowed. Impossible even. I felt something warm and sharp swell in my chest, the kind of ache that comes from finally seeing a man, not as the world sees him, but as he is under all the armor. Luke continued, "And when I met you that night, you reminded me of someone I used to be, someone who wanted to show up for hope, even when it hurt." He let out a breath that shook just a little the first crack in his composure. "And that terrified me because you were not supposed to matter. Not like that. Not so quickly. Not when I barely knew where you lived or what you dreamed of, or why someone like you kept fighting so hard to stay afloat." My voice was barely a whisper. "So, you left?" He nodded slowly, the guilt in his expression unguarded. "I left because I felt something real forming, and when you left that restaurant with that look on your face, I knew I could either move towards you or disappear before you ever had the chance to depend on me. And for a man who lost everything once disappearing, felt safer." The words hit like soft blows, each one tender but painful because they revealed something I had not let myself consider. He had not walked away because he did not care. He had walked away because he cared too much. I forced myself to breathe steady and asked the question that still clung to my chest. Then why reach out when everything in your world says you do not have to? Luke leaned back slightly, rubbing his thumb across his palm as if grounding himself. "Because I saw your name on a list at the foundation. Someone had mentioned you in a meeting, a woman who volunteers at the clinic near your neighborhood. She said you were bright, dedicated, compassionate." He gave a small, almost incredulous laugh. And all I could think was, how could I sit in a room full of people discussing candidates when the one person who had already proven more heart than all of them was struggling to afford heat? My eyes stung. I looked down at my hands, twisting anxiously in my lap. Luke's voice softened. "I wanted to recommend you not because you needed saving, but because you deserved a chance. A door that opened for once instead of closing in your face." He hesitated, then added, "I did not put you on that list because you were someone I felt sorry for. I put you on it because you are someone the world should notice." Something inside me cracked, then mended in the same breath. No one had ever said anything like that to me. Not without agenda, not without pity, not without expecting something in return. Luke watched my reaction carefully, as if bracing for me to break or pull away. But all I could manage was a trembling whisper. "You could have told me." He nodded, his gaze dropping for the first time. "I should have, but I did not know how to ask you to trust me when I did not yet trust myself." Silence settled again, gentle, heavy, intimate. I studied his face, the lines of exhaustion, the shadow of grief, the careful strength he used to hold himself together. And under all of that, something else, something fragile and real. I said quietly, "Luke, I never wanted anything from you. Not money, not opportunity, not protection." He looked up, meeting my eyes with an intensity that made my pulse jump. And that he said is exactly why I could not stay away any longer. For the first time since my life had collapsed piece by piece, I felt something shift, not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. I leaned back, letting the truth settle, letting it fill spaces inside me that had been empty for so long. When I spoke, my voice was steady, even if my heart was not. I am not good at trusting people. I am not good at believing I deserve anything better than what I've had. Luke's expression softened into something quiet and deeply sincere. "Then let me earn it. Not with grand gestures, not with money, not with promises I cannot keep. Just with truth." He held my gaze unwavering. "Starting now." I nodded once slowly, then again, because the truth he offered was not perfect, but it was real, and sometimes real is the only thing you need to begin again. Luke exhaled gently, like he had been waiting for that single nod far longer than he would ever admit. For a moment, neither of us said another word. We just sat there in the quiet glow of a room suspended between what we had been and what we might become, both of us finally unhidden, finally honest. And for the first time since the night in that restaurant, I felt something bloom inside my chest that I had thought was lost forever. Light. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of quiet nervousness that coils low in your stomach long before you admit it is there, and despite everything Luke had told me, despite every truth we had finally spoken to each other, I could not stop my hands from trembling as I zipped up the simple navy dress I had borrowed from a friend at the clinic. It was nothing fancy, but I had never owned anything that made me feel so grown and so exposed all at once. When I stepped into the lobby of the Brennan Foundation building, I felt like a misplaced puzzle piece in a world polished too smooth for someone like me. Golden light washed over white stone floors. Conversations murmured in warm, sophisticated rhythms. Men in tailored suits. Women in gowns that looked like they belonged to another universe entirely. And somewhere in the midst of all of that stood Luke. Tall, composed, elegant in a charcoal suit that made him look far more like the CEO the world believed him to be, and far less like the man who had once sat across from me in a restaurant watching a stranger hold herself together with nothing but sheer will. When he saw me, his expression softened in a way I was not prepared for. Not dramatic, not startled, not devouring, just a slow, warm recognition that felt like an anchor dropped into my chest. "Anna," he said quietly, as if my name alone held the weight of a promise. For a moment, everything else faded, the noise, the lights, the polished voices floating around us, and there was only him and me and the strange, fragile thing growing in the space between us. He guided me gently into the main hall where rows of tables were lined with candles and centerpieces and smiling donors eager to be seen supporting a good cause. I reminded myself to breathe, to keep my shoulders back, to not let anyone see how small I felt inside. Luke stayed close, but not possessively, just enough for me to feel his presence steadying me without taking away my ability to stand on my own. We made small talk with a few board members. I tried not to stumble over my words. Luke stepped in only when necessary, always giving me the space to finish my thoughts, always glancing at me like he was silently saying, "You belong here, even if you don't believe it yet." I was starting to relax when it happened. A woman in a deep red dress, someone I recognized from social media and business articles, approached with a glass of champagne in hand and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You must be Anna," she said brightly, "the girl from the restaurant, the one he took such an interest in." Something in her tone made my skin prickle. I forced a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." She tilted her head, her voice dropping just enough that only Luke and I could hear. "Tell me, because everyone is whispering about it. How does someone go from failing out of 2 part-time jobs to landing a position at one of the most competitive foundations in the state?" Her smile sharpened. "Unless, of course, it wasn't the job you were after." Heat rushed to my face, a sting deep and old rising from places inside me that had been bruised too many times before. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She chuckled softly, as if she already knew she had won. Luke stepped forward before I could blink. His voice, calm, quiet, unmistakably firm. "That's enough." The woman raised a brow, amused. "I'm simply asking the question everyone is thinking." Luke didn't flinch. Anna earned her position. If anything, we are the ones lucky to have her. His tone was steady, but there was steel underneath, the kind that didn't need volume to command a room. The woman blinked surprise flickering across her features before she masked it with another tight smile. "Of course," she murmured, stepping back. "If you say so." She left with a swish of silk and perfume, but the sting she intended lingered in my chest like a bruise. I stared at the floor, eyes burning. Luke turned to me instantly, his voice dropping lower. "Anna, look at me." I lifted my gaze hesitantly. His expression softened, the edges of his posture easing, as if stepping toward me meant stepping toward something he refused to let slip away again. "They don't know you," he said gently. "They don't know what you've survived or what you've built out of nothing, and they don't get to define you." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. You don't have to defend me, Luke. He held my gaze unwavering. Yes, I do. Because you deserve to be seen for the truth, not for the assumptions people make when they're threatened by someone who doesn't fit their narrow world. Emotion tightened my throat. It had been so long since anyone stood for me publicly, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Then the next moment unfolded so quietly, I almost missed it. A small cluster of journalists approached, and the woman in red returned with them, voice sharp, like she was preparing to push something into a headline. Mr. Brennan, can you comment on allegations of favoritism regarding your new foundation hire? My stomach dropped. Eyes swiveled toward me, heat rushing to my cheeks. Humiliation roaring in my ears. But before I could take a step back, before I could shrink or disappear or find a way to melt into the floor, Luke reached for my hand. Not subtly, not cautiously, not quietly. He took it in full view of everyone, his fingers lacing through mine with the certainty of a man who had finally stopped running from what he wanted. Every conversation in the room faltered into silence. Luke looked squarely at the cameras, then at the woman who had been trying to tear me down. There was no anger in his voice, only truth shaped with clarity and strength. Anna did not need my help. I needed hers. A murmur rippled through the room, but Luke kept going, his hand warm, steady, anchoring mine. She is here because she works harder than anyone in this building, because she asks the questions others overlook, because she cares deeply and without condition, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard and messy and uncomfortable. He paused, then added with a quiet conviction that stole the air from my lungs. And because from the moment I met her, she reminded me what integrity looks like. The room fell entirely still. Then applause rose, not polite, not forced, but genuine. The kind that starts small, then swells like a wave gathering strength. Faces softened, eyes warmed. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not as a burden, not as a charity case, not as the girl with $5 and an empty plate, but as someone worthy, someone enough, someone chosen. Luke squeezed my hand gently, leaning closer so only I could hear. I will never let anyone diminish you again. Not while I'm here. I swallowed hard, unable to speak past the rush of emotion. We stood there surrounded by applause lights and eyes, but somehow it felt like the world had shrunk to only two people. Him and me. And the truth neither of us had dared to name until now. He stood beside me, and this time he did not let go. The year that followed did not unfold like a fairy tale, and maybe that is why it felt real in a way nothing else in my life ever had, because healing never arrives in grand gestures, but in small, steady moments. And that is exactly how the next 12 months changed everything for Luke, for me, and for Sophie. I moved into a small apartment 2 blocks from the Brennan Foundation, not because Luke offered to help with rent, but because I wanted to stand on my own feet, and he understood that without me ever having to say it. He visited sometimes after work with Sophie running ahead of him carrying drawings she insisted I put on my refrigerator. Other nights I walked to his home where we cooked dinner together while Sophie set the table humming a little tune she claimed she made up, but sounded suspiciously like the lullaby I had sung to her months earlier. At work, Luke and I learned the delicate art of being on the same team without letting our personal feelings blur the mission we were building. The Open Table Initiative. The program he created after meeting me grew faster than anyone predicted. We expanded meal assistance for single mothers, offered resume classes, brought in therapists for families navigating trauma, and slowly, the foundation became a place where people walked in with their heads down, but walked out believing they deserved more than just survival. And through all of that, Luke stayed the same in the ways that mattered. Gentle, steady, thoughtful, but he also changed in ways I never expected. The shadows that once hovered behind his eyes began to lift piece by fragile piece as though someone had slowly been relighting the dimmed corners of his life. Sometimes he would look at Sophie as she painted or twirled or pressed stickers onto her notebooks, and I would see his throat tighten, his eyes shimmer not with grief anymore, but with gratitude. Other times he looked at me with that same softness, a quiet recognition of something he no longer feared losing. We never rushed anything. We never stamped labels on what we were becoming. We simply lived days that stitched themselves together. until one morning I realized I was waking up not with dread or loneliness, but with the strange, warm certainty that my life was no longer something I braced myself against. It was something I was growing into. The first anniversary of the Open Table Initiative arrived on a crisp spring day. The foundation hosted a community celebration with long tables covered in flowers, children running everywhere, and volunteers serving meals to families who had once walked through our doors with nothing. When Luke stepped onto the small stage to give his speech, he looked for me first before saying a single word. He never said it aloud, but I knew. That night at the restaurant had not just redirected my life. It had saved his, too. After the celebration was over, after the last table was folded and the last child was carried home, Luke walked toward me with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled to his elbows the way he always looked when the world finally felt quiet enough for him to breathe. "Anna," he said softly, "want to take a drive?" There was something in his voice, warm, unhurried, but purposeful, and even though he did not explain, I nodded. Sophie fell asleep in her car seat. Within minutes, her tiny hand curled around her stuffed bunny. Luke drove us out of the city down winding roads lined with tall pines until the familiar shape appeared through the windshield. It took me a moment to understand why my breath caught. It was the restaurant, the place where everything had begun. I stared at it as though seeing a photograph of my former self through glass, the wooden booths, the soft lighting, the memory of sitting alone clutching $5 like a shield against humiliation. Luke pulled into a reserved parking space and turned off the engine. He looked at me with that steady understanding that had always made me feel seen. "Come on," he whispered. We walked inside together, Sophie half asleep in his arms. The hostess recognized Luke instantly and led us to a quiet corner table, the same one where I had once sat waiting for a man who never showed up, praying no one would notice how hard I was pretending to be okay. But tonight was different. Tonight, I sat between a man who had chosen me long before either of us understood what that meant, and a little girl who had woven herself into the fabric of my life with crayons and laughter and trust. Dinner was simple pasta, warm bread, lemonade, and quiet conversations. Sophie fell asleep with her head on my lap while Luke paid the bill at the counter. Then he came back, his expression more tender than I had ever seen it. "Anna," he said, pulling out a small velvet box. I used to think light only came in flashes in rare moments you hold on to because the dark takes everything else. His voice trembled barely, but it was there. But then you showed up in the smallest, quietest way, and suddenly everything in my life began to turn back toward daybreak. He opened the box. The ring was simple, the stone modest, but the meaning heavier than gold. "I do not want to save you," he whispered. "I do not want you to save me. I just want to stay if you will let me." We did not need an audience. We did not need a spotlight or applause. We had this tiny booth where humiliation had once lived and where healing now sat instead. I nodded, tears burning hot behind my eyes, not from fear or desperation, but from a deep, still certainty. "Yes, Luke. Yes." He exhaled like he had been holding that breath for a year, kissed my forehead gently, and wrapped his free arm around both me and Sophie. Outside the restaurant, the night was cool, the sky clear, the world quiet in the way it becomes only for people who have finally learned how to stop running. I looked back at the doorway, the place where one version of me had ended and another had begun. "I only had $5 that night," I whispered. Luke squeezed my hand, and it turned out to be enough to lead me here, enough to change everything, enough to turn my whole life toward the light. If this story found a quiet place in your heart tonight, then maybe it is because you know exactly what it feels like to sit alone at a table you hoped would change your life. Maybe you know what it means to hold on to the last $5 in your pocket, not because it is enough, but because it is all you have. Maybe you know the sting of being overlooked, the ache of waiting for someone who never shows up, the heaviness of pretending you are fine, when the truth is, the world has been far too loud and far too cruel for far too long. And maybe, just maybe you also know what it feels like when a small, unexpected kindness shifts the ground beneath your feet when someone sees you. Not as a burden, not as a mistake, and not as an afterthought, but as a human being worth looking at, worth listening to, worth staying for. And if that resonates with you even for a second, then let this story remind you of something people often forget. You deserve the kind of love that does not make you beg. You deserve the kind of tenderness that does not ask you to shrink. You deserve the kind of safety that does not disappear. When life gets hard, you deserve a seat at a table where no one laughs at your hope, no one mocks your hunger, no one punishes you for believing that something good might still be waiting for you just around the corner. And if tonight's story stirred something in you, if it sparked a memory, or softened a bruise, or reminded you of the person you once were, before life took its toll, then I want to ask you to stay a little while longer, because what we do here on this channel is more than storytelling. We gather the pieces of people's hearts, we hold up the quiet, forgotten voices. We honor the bruised, the tired, the brave, and the gentle. We tell the stories that remind you you are not alone. You are not foolish for believing in kindness. You are not silly for longing for connection. You are simply human, and that is enough. So if you want more stories that lift you when you sink, that hold your hand through the dark, that remind you, love does not have an expiration date, and second chances do not come with an age limit, then please make sure you subscribe right now, because we have so many more stories for you. Stories of the woman who opened her door in a snowstorm for a stranger and found a family. Stories of the girl who was humiliated in a wedding dress boutique until one man stepped forward and changed her life. Stories of the single father who thought he had nothing left to give until he realized love is not measured in perfection but in presence. And stories of people like you, people who have been hurt, forgotten, underestimated, but still somehow found the strength to hope. Again, every like, every comment, every share helps us reach more hearts like yours, helps us tell more stories like this one, and helps remind the world that kindness is not outdated. Love is not gone, and healing can happen at any age, no matter what the world tells you. So, if you felt anything tonight, if your breath caught, or your chest tightened, or your eyes burned just a little, then do not leave without joining us here, because somewhere out there right now, someone else is sitting at a lonely table, waiting for a sign that their life can still change. And you, clicking subscribe, might be the thing that sends this story their way. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and thank you for believing that love still finds those who keep their hearts open, even when the world gives them every reason to close it. Stay with us. The next story might just be the one that changes everything for you too.